For weeks, everyone assumed they knew what happened inside Nancy Guthrie's home on the night she disappeared. A violent struggle, an attack, chaos, the kind of frantic, desperate scene that plays out when someone fights back against an intruder. The blood evidence tells a completely different story. New information, drawn from investigative reporting by Ashley Banfield of News Nation and expert forensic analysis, has revealed something that changes the entire picture of what happened during those critical minutes between when Nancy's doorbell camera went dark and when her pacemaker sent its final signal. Not a story of violence and chaos, a story of something far more disturbing. Control, precision, deliberate, methodical movement, and the specific location where investigators found that blood inside the home changes everything we thought we understood about how Nancy Guthrie was taken. This is the verdict room. We examine the evidence, we follow the facts, and at the end of every investigation, we deliver the verdict. If you are new here, subscribe right now and hit that notification bell. Every single week, we go deeper than the headlines, bringing you the forensic analysis, the expert breakdowns, and the investigative details that change the way you understand these cases. If you are already part of this community, hit that like button right now. It helps more people find investigations like this one. Cases that deserve to be remembered. Cases that deserve answers. Now let us talk about what the evidence actually shows. Before we examine a single forensic detail, we need to establish who this investigation is actually about. Because the moment a person becomes a case study, the moment they become a collection of evidence and timelines rather than a human being, we lose the most important thing about any investigation. Nancy Guthrie was a woman who lived independently in the Tucson community she loved for most of her life. She was the mother of Savannah Guthrie, co-anchor of NBC's Today Show. But to the people who knew her in Tucson, Nancy was defined by her own life, her sharp mind, her fierce independence, her deep love of privacy. She lived alone in her home in the Catalina foothills. She managed her own affairs. Her family described her as mentally sharp, present, and fully engaged with the world around her. On the night of January 31st, 2026, her son-in-law dropped her off at her home after a family gathering. She walked to her front door, unlocked it, stepped inside, and went to bed. Hours later, she was gone. By the early morning hours of February 1st, 2026, when family members arrived to check on her, they found blood near the front of the home, a disabled doorbell camera, and footage of a masked figure who had approached in the darkness. For weeks, the public focus centered on the blood evidence visible outside Nancy's home. The droplets on the front walkway, the questions about what they meant, what they suggested about how she was taken and where she went. Theories circulated, assumptions formed. Most people, understandably, assumed what the evidence seemed to suggest on the surface. A violent struggle, chaos, a physical confrontation that left evidence of force. But there was always one piece of information that remained hidden, one detail that investigators knew and the public did not. The blood did not start outside. It started inside. And where it started, and the pattern it created, reveals something about this case that no surface-level analysis has captured. This is based on publicly available information, expert forensic analysis, investigative reporting by Ashley Banfield of News Nation, and official statements from law enforcement. All individuals referenced are innocent unless proven guilty in a court of law. Expert interpretations of physical evidence represent forensic analysis of documented patterns, not conclusions about any specific individual's guilt. According to investigative reporting by Ashley Banfield of News Nation, who has developed sources close to the investigation, blood was found inside Nancy Guthrie's home, not in the bedroom, not in the hallway leading from the bedroom, not in multiple rooms suggesting a chase or a struggle across the interior. In one location, the front entrance hallway, the area just inside the front door, and the pattern of blood inside the house is identical to the pattern outside. The same vertical droplets, the same undisturbed appearance, the same characteristics that forensic experts use to determine not just the presence of blood, but the story behind it. The blood begins inside the front entrance. It continues over the threshold of the front door. It leads down the front walkway, and it stops at a point consistent with where a vehicle would be parked on the street. This is information that had not been made public before Ashley Banfield's reporting, and it raises immediate questions that cut directly to the heart of what happened during those critical minutes inside Nancy's home. If Nancy was attacked in her bedroom, why is there no blood in the bedroom? If she was dragged or moved through the house in a struggle, why is there no blood trail from the interior toward the front entrance? If there was a violent physical confrontation, why are the blood droplets undisturbed and vertical? To answer these questions with the rigor they demand, Ashley Banfield consulted Dr. Peter Valentine, an associate professor and department chair of forensic science at the University of New Haven. Dr. Valentine has testified as a blood stain pattern expert in 7 states and in federal court. His analysis of this evidence is both precise and deeply illuminating, and what he found challenges every assumption that has shaped this investigation from the beginning. Dr. Valentine identified the blood as drip stains, blood falling from a source purely by gravity, with no force or external energy involved. Not blood from a violent impact, not blood sprayed during a physical struggle, not the kind of pattern that results from chaos and force, blood dripping, falling, controlled by nothing more than gravity. That distinction matters more than it might initially appear. It is not a minor technical detail. It is the entire difference between a story of violence and a story of something else entirely. Here is what vertical, undisturbed drip stains communicate to an experienced forensic investigator. This was slow, this was controlled, this was deliberate. When someone is running, blood droplets elongate and show directionality. The physics of movement affect the shape and spacing of each drop. When someone is being dragged, the droplets smear. The pattern disrupts. When there is a physical fight, a genuine struggle between 2 people, the blood pattern shows that disruption. Footprints through the blood, smears where bodies moved, the kind of scattered, irregular pattern that reflects chaos and force. None of that exists here. The droplets are circular, which in forensic terms means the source was directly overhead, positioned so that gravity could pull each drop in a clean, uninterrupted vertical fall. The droplets are undisturbed, meaning no one stepped through them, no one fought over them, no one moved through the area in a way that disturbed the pattern after the blood fell. The scene around those droplets shows none of the disruption that a violent struggle would leave behind. Most significantly, Dr. Valentine identified what forensic scientists call satellite spatter within the pattern. Tiny secondary droplets created when blood falls into blood that has already accumulated on the surface. One drop lands, then another drop falls into that first drop before it is dried. The impact creates a small secondary splash, tiny droplets radiating outward from the point of contact. The presence of satellite spatter tells investigators something critical about the timeline of events. For satellite spatter to form, the source of the blood must remain stationary, or nearly stationary, long enough for multiple drops to fall in the same location. This is not a pattern created by someone moving quickly. It is a pattern created by someone who stopped, someone who paused at that threshold for what Dr. Valentine described as a not insignificant amount of time. Not passing through quickly, not rushing, stopped. Something happened at that front threshold that required time. Opening a heavy front door while managing something, or someone, of significant weight. Adjusting position, preparing for the next phase of whatever was happening. And during that pause, blood dripped and accumulated in a single location, creating the satellite spatter that Dr. Valentine identified. Think carefully about what this reveals about the person who took Nancy Guthrie. He was not panicking. He was not rushing. He was not making the kind of frantic mistakes that come from fear or desperation. He was in control, calm enough that the blood falling behind him created neat vertical circular droplets, calm enough to stop at a threshold and manage the logistics of what he was doing without disrupting the evidence pattern around him. This was not a crime of impulse. This was not someone who broke into a home in a moment of desperation and found himself overwhelmed by what he had started. The blood pattern communicates something about the psychological state of the person who created it, and what it communicates is deliberate, methodical control. Now, there is a question that investigators and analysts have examined carefully. Is this blood from Nancy herself, or from a weapon or object that carried her blood? Some theories suggested the perpetrator may have been carrying a weapon, and the blood dripping was from that weapon rather than from Nancy directly. Dr. Valentine's forensic analysis addresses this directly. When blood is on an object being carried, a weapon, a tool, any surface with a finite amount of blood on it, the available blood decreases over time as drops fall. The object has a limited blood supply. As the drops fall, there is less blood remaining on the surface. The spacing between drops increases progressively because there simply is not enough blood on the object to maintain the same drip rate over distance. The pattern inside Nancy's home and outside on the walkway does not show that increasing spacing. The droplets do not show the progressive decrease in frequency that would indicate a finite diminishing source. They show what forensic analysts expect from an active source, a person who is bleeding, not an object carrying a limited quantity of blood. The volume of blood observed across two distinct patterns, one inside, one outside, is consistent with an active biological source rather than a surface that was carrying transferred blood. And Sheriff Chris Nanos confirmed publicly that the blood is Nancy's. DNA testing verified this. The question was never whose blood it was. The question, the one that Dr. Valentine's analysis helps answer, is what the pattern itself tells us about what happened. For blood to fall in vertical droplets and create circular stains on a surface, there must be a clear, unobstructed path from the source to the ground. The blood cannot be absorbed by clothing or blocked by any obstruction. It needs to fall freely, directly downward, guided by nothing but gravity. If Nancy was bleeding from her head or face, that area of her body would need to be positioned so that blood could fall in a direct vertical line to the floor beneath. The circular shape of the droplets forensically confirms that the source was directly overhead, positioned above each drop as it fell. Consider what that means physically. We know from the doorbell footage that a masked figure approached Nancy's home in the early morning hours. We know from Savannah Guthrie's public statements that her mother was taken from her bed in the darkness. We know from the digital record that motion was detected inside the house, suggesting someone moving through the interior. This was not Nancy walking voluntarily to her front door. This was Nancy being taken. So the question becomes, how was she carried in a way that would create this specific blood pattern? Ashley Banfield developed a theory based on the physical evidence, the forensic analysis, and the documented characteristics of the blood pattern. She believes the evidence is consistent with Nancy being carried over the perpetrator's shoulder. In that position, her head and upper body would hang down behind him. If she was bleeding from her face or head, blood would fall in a direct vertical line behind him as he walked, straight down to the floor beneath her hanging position, not scattered or smeared, not disrupted by his movement because he is walking forward and the blood is falling behind him into the space he has already passed through. When he reached the front threshold, the heavy front door of the home, he stopped. He needed to manage that door while carrying an adult woman. During that pause, blood continued to fall in one location. The satellite spatter formed. Multiple drops accumulated in the same spot as he stood still long enough to open the door, shift his position, prepare to step through. Then he moved. He adjusted. He stepped through the doorway with the same slow, controlled pace. He walked down the front walkway, and at a point consistent with where a vehicle would be parked at the curb, the blood trail ends. Nancy was placed in that vehicle. The repositioning changed the blood flow, or pressure was applied to the injury. The dripping stopped, and Nancy disappeared into the darkness. Dr. Valentine was asked directly about this theory. His assessment, it is as plausible as anything else the evidence supports, and he added something that carries significant investigative weight. If Nancy was carried over someone's shoulder with her head or upper body in the position the blood pattern suggests, blood would have landed on the perpetrator's back, on the fabric between his shoulder blades, on a part of his own body that he could not see. Think about what that means for the investigation. When someone commits a crime and attempts to remove evidence afterward, they focus on what they can see: the front of their clothing, their hands, their shoes, the surfaces they know they touched. They do not think about their back. They cannot see it. They may not realize that blood absorbed into the fabric between their shoulder blades as they carried Nancy through her home and down that walkway. If this theory is correct, there is blood evidence on the back of the perpetrator's clothing that he may never have considered destroying, on a jacket that went back into a closet, on a shirt that went into a laundry hamper, on clothing that was discarded but could still be recovered. Fabric holds evidence in ways that are extraordinarily difficult to fully eliminate, and evidence the perpetrator did not know to destroy is often the evidence that ultimately solves cases. There is another question that the blood pattern raises and that Dr. Valentine addressed directly. If Nancy was attacked or controlled in her bedroom, why does the blood only appear at the front entrance? This is where forensic science diverges from intuitive assumption. Investigators and the public alike often see blood in one location and assume that location is where the injury occurred. But blood does not always begin dripping immediately after an injury. It takes time for blood to accumulate, time to reach the surface of skin, to saturate clothing or hair, to flow and pool enough to fall freely. Everyone has had the experience of a cut that does not bleed immediately, a delay between the injury and the visible evidence of it. That same principle applies in this context at a larger scale. A wound may bleed internally before it reaches the surface. Blood may be absorbed by clothing or hair for some time before it accumulates enough to drip. Nancy could have sustained her injury in her bedroom. The blood could have been absorbed by her clothing or her hair during the initial moments. As she was carried through the house, past her kitchen, through the hallway, toward the front entrance, the blood continued to accumulate. By the time she reached the front door, it had built up enough to begin falling freely. The front entrance is where the blood pattern became visible, but it is not necessarily where the story began. This timeline is more disturbing than a simple bedroom attack would suggest. It means Nancy was controlled in her bedroom without leaving visible blood evidence. She was moved through her entire house, past the rooms that defined her daily life, through the home she had lived in and felt safe in, without the injury being visible to anyone who might have looked. Only at the front entrance did the blood reach the point of falling freely. That level of control does not happen accidentally. That is not the behavior of someone who acted impulsively and found themselves improvising. That is the behavior of someone who had thought through what they were doing, who understood the physical logistics of what the operation required, and executed it with the kind of calm that comes from preparation. When the first law enforcement officers arrived at Nancy's home in the early morning hours of February 1, 2026, they initially believed they were responding to a missing elderly person, perhaps someone who had wandered, perhaps a medical episode. But when more experienced investigators arrived and assessed the scene, the picture shifted immediately. They found the back door standing open, not unlocked, not just unlatched, wide open, standing open in a way that communicated something specific about how entry was made and how the scene was left. Nancy's family had indicated to investigators that she routinely left her back doors unlocked. In the Catalina foothills, many longtime residents maintain a sense of security that reflects the character of the neighborhood. But there is a fundamental difference between a door that is unlocked, closed but unsecured, something you would only discover by trying the handle, and a door that is standing wide open when investigators arrive. A door that is wide open was either left open during the event itself or opened afterward and not closed. Either way, it tells investigators something about the entry point, the movement through the home, and the manner in which whoever was there departed. The working understanding from investigators and forensic analysts is this: the perpetrator likely entered through the unlocked back door. He knew it would be unlocked, not because he guessed, but because he had knowledge of Nancy's habits and routines. He moved through the house to her bedroom. He controlled her there in a way that did not immediately produce visible blood evidence. He then carried her back through the house toward the front entrance, and the blood began to fall as she was carried through the front hallway. He stopped at the threshold to manage the front door. Blood accumulated. He stepped through, walked down the front walkway, reached the vehicle, and placed Nancy inside. The blood trail ends at the street. Nancy was gone. The physical evidence creates this timeline even without witnesses, even without surveillance footage of the interior. The pattern of blood, its location, its characteristics, its forensic meaning, tells a story that the evidence itself insists on telling. But Dr. Valentine emphasized something in his analysis that carries implications beyond this specific case. Something that investigators and the public following this investigation need to understand clearly. You only find the evidence you are looking for, and if you approach a scene with the wrong understanding of what that scene represents, if your assumptions about what happened lead you to look for the wrong things, you can walk directly past evidence that would change everything. When investigators first processed Nancy Guthrie's home, what were they looking for? Were they looking for the signs of a carefully controlled, deliberate abduction? Were they examining the bedroom for the subtle forensic traces that would indicate how Nancy was subdued in a way that left no visible blood evidence? Were they processing every surface for the microscopic trace evidence, fibers, soil, biological material, that would tell the story of how someone moved through the home with an adult woman over their shoulder? Or were they operating under the assumption of a violent crime, looking for overturned furniture, broken items, the visible signs of physical struggle, and potentially missing the evidence that a more controlled, deliberate crime leaves behind? The crime scene was released back to the family approximately 30 hours after Nancy disappeared. Dr. Valentine was asked directly whether that was appropriate for a case of this complexity and forensic significance. His response was unequivocal. "I would have held that house for as long as I possibly could." This is not a minor procedural disagreement. In a case where forensic evidence is the primary driver of the investigation, where there are no reliable witnesses, no obvious suspect emerging from traditional investigative channels, no clear motive pointing to a specific individual, the physical evidence is not supporting material. It is the investigation. Every surface, every fiber, every trace element is a potential pathway to resolution. Releasing that scene after 30 hours means accepting that what was collected in that window is all that will ever be collected. There is no returning to a scene that has been released, cleaned, and restored to family use. Dr. Valentine described a specific category of criminal investigation. He estimates approximately 5 to 10% of cases, where forensic evidence does not run in parallel with detective work but instead leads it entirely. In those cases, without the physical evidence providing direction, the investigation has nowhere to go. The Nancy Guthrie case, by the characteristics of the scene and the absence of traditional investigative entry points, falls into that category. And when a case falls into that category, protecting the physical evidence is not a procedural preference. It is the foundation on which everything else is built. There are specific items from Nancy's home that forensic analysts have identified as potentially critical, items whose early processing could have provided evidence that may now be unavailable. The welcome mat at Nancy's front door remained in place for weeks after the disappearance. It was visible to journalists. It was accessible to anyone who approached the home. Dr. Valentine described that mat as potentially containing trace evidence of significant investigative value: fibers from a vehicle's interior, soil from a specific geographic location, microscopic material from clothing or shoes that could connect a suspect to the scene. Processing a doormat is painstaking, time-consuming work. There would be enormous amounts of environmental debris to sort through. But within that debris could be exactly the kind of specific, distinctive material that bridges the gap between a suspect and a crime scene. That mat should have been collected immediately, sealed, and preserved for laboratory analysis. Instead, it remained exposed. The bracket that held Nancy's Nest doorbell camera was also not collected immediately. The perpetrator removed that camera. He touched the bracket. He manipulated it in the process of disabling the surveillance system. Any interaction with that surface, particularly if he had a light source in his mouth while working, as some forensic analysts have suggested based on the footage, could have deposited biological material. Saliva transferred from a gloved hand, skin cells from the edges of gloves, DNA evidence that could have survived on that bracket under proper forensic preservation. Investigators eventually collected the bracket, but not until approximately 3 weeks after Nancy disappeared. In those 3 weeks, DNA evidence can degrade significantly, particularly on outdoor surfaces exposed to weather and temperature variation. Dr. Valentine calls these unforced errors, mistakes made under the specific pressure of high-profile investigations that cannot be undone once they occur. The pressure of a high-profile case, the pressure of an involved and prominent family, the pressure of intense media attention that creates an expectation of visible progress. All of this generates an environment in which investigators feel compelled to move quickly, to show activity, to demonstrate responsiveness, to process and release and proceed rather than to hold and examine and process again. And in Dr. Valentine's professional experience, that pressure leads to the kinds of decisions that compromise investigations in ways that are only fully understood later, when the case has stalled and the question of why sits unanswered. Sheriff Nanos himself, early in the investigation, acknowledged a version of this. When asked whether he would have done anything differently, he said at that time, essentially, Monday morning quarterback, I probably would have held the scene longer. That was an acknowledgement, a recognition that in hindsight, the timeline for releasing the scene did not serve the investigation as well as it might have. Later, in a more recent interview with local media, the sheriff said something different, that he had no regrets about his team's efforts and did not regret releasing the crime scene when they did. Dr. Valentine did not comment on that specific contradiction directly, but his analysis of what happens when investigations are driven by pressure rather than methodical forensic process speaks to the gap between those two statements. Now, we need to address something that the blood evidence raises and that every person following this case deserves to have addressed directly. The volume of blood visible in the documented evidence is significant, but not catastrophic. Dr. Valentine was careful and precise in his assessment. This is an injury that requires medical attention. The volume observed is consistent with a wound that is serious, but not necessarily immediately life-threatening without intervention. But, and this is a critical qualification, the blood pattern tells us about one specific injury at one specific moment. It does not tell us about the totality of what Nancy experienced. It does not tell us what happened after she was placed in that vehicle. It does not tell us whether she received medical care, whether her condition was monitored, whether the people who took her had any intention of keeping her alive beyond the immediate event. Savannah Guthrie's most recent public statement indicated that the family wants Nancy home so they can give her a place of final rest. That language, careful, deliberate, heartbreaking, suggests the family believes Nancy did not survive. Sheriff Nanos, in a separate public statement, made a direct appeal to whoever took Nancy. Just give her up. Let her go. Take her to a clinic, a hospital. Drop her off. Just let her go. That appeal suggests the sheriff believes there remains a possibility, however diminished by time, that Nancy might still be alive. These two perspectives represent the painful, unresolved uncertainty that has defined this investigation. The blood evidence does not resolve that uncertainty. What it tells us is that at the moment Nancy was being carried from her home, she had sustained an injury that was bleeding. What happened in the hours and days after that moment is a question the blood pattern cannot answer. But there is one more thing the blood evidence tells us. Something with direct, practical, investigative implications. There is blood in the vehicle that transported Nancy. Dr. Valentine was emphatic about this. The blood trail ends at a point on the front walkway consistent with where a vehicle would have been parked. When Nancy was repositioned, from being carried over a shoulder to being placed inside a vehicle, the dynamics of her position changed. The injury that was dripping either was no longer positioned to fall freely, or pressure was applied to manage the bleeding. The dripping stopped. But before it stopped, blood was falling, and some of that blood went into the vehicle. Blood is extraordinarily difficult to completely remove from a vehicle interior. Most people who attempt to clean blood from a surface stop when they can no longer see the color red. When the visible evidence is gone, they believe the evidence is gone. But the chemical components of blood remain long after the color has been removed. They are invisible to the naked eye. They are detectable, reliably, scientifically, forensically, with specialized reagents designed specifically to find blood that has been cleaned, treated, or otherwise obscured. Even if the perpetrator spent significant time cleaning that vehicle, even if chemical cleaners were used, even if every visible trace was removed, there is a high forensic probability that latent blood evidence remains detectable in that vehicle's interior, and that blood would be Nancy's. It would place her in that specific vehicle at the time she was bleeding. It would be powerful physical evidence connecting the vehicle, and by extension the vehicle's owner or regular driver, to what happened to Nancy Guthrie. The FBI has been canvassing Nancy's neighborhood, requesting surveillance footage from residents, working to build a timeline of vehicles present in the area in the relevant window. If that vehicle is identified, the forensic pathway is direct. Test for latent blood. Compare DNA. Build the case from evidence that cannot be argued away in court. The blood evidence tells us that vehicle exists. It tells us that vehicle contains evidence. Finding it remains one of the most significant potential investigative breakthroughs available in this case. Before we get to what all of this tells us about the person responsible, we need to address one more dimension of the forensic picture: the question of the back door and what it tells investigators about the full scope of planning involved in this operation. When investigators processed Nancy's home, they found the back door standing wide open. Not merely unlocked, standing open. Nancy's family confirmed that she had a habit of leaving her back doors unlocked, a common practice in the Catalina foothills, where many longtime residents feel a sense of security rooted in years of quiet neighborhood life. But as noted earlier, there is an essential distinction between a door that is unlocked and a door that is standing open when investigators arrive. An unlocked door tells you someone may have known the door would be accessible. A door left wide open tells you something about the mindset of whoever was last through it. It could indicate that the back door was the primary exit, that after carrying Nancy through the house to the front entrance and down the walkway to the street, whoever was responsible re-entered the home to retrieve something, or that the back door was left open during the operation itself and never secured upon departure. In the context of everything else the evidence shows, the planned reconnaissance, the deliberate approach to the front camera, the controlled movement through the interior, an open back door is a detail that investigators would need to reconstruct carefully. Did the perpetrator enter through the back and depart through the front? Did he re-enter after placing Nancy in the vehicle? Did he leave the back door open intentionally, as a kind of staged element to suggest a hasty departure that contradicted the careful, methodical nature of everything else? Or was it simply the last door he came through, left open in the final moments of an operation that had otherwise been executed with precision? Forensic analysts examining this case have noted that the open back door, placed alongside the blood pattern at the front entrance, creates a movement map: entry through the back, movement through the interior, exit through the front with Nancy. The physical narrative of the evidence traces that path, and the path itself speaks to someone who was comfortable moving through the home, who knew its layout well enough to navigate it in the darkness of the early morning hours without creating the kind of disruption that a stranger encountering an unfamiliar space would almost certainly produce. A stranger in a dark, unfamiliar home, navigating to a specific bedroom, controlling someone without leaving evidence of struggle, and carrying them out through the correct door to a waiting vehicle. All of this requires a level of advanced knowledge that the evidence consistently points toward. Now let us step back and consider what the totality of this blood evidence tells us, not just about the physical events of the night Nancy disappeared, but about the person responsible for them. The pattern of blood inside Nancy's home and on the front walkway communicates something that forensic analysis makes difficult to argue against. Vertical droplets, circular stains, no disruption, satellite spatter indicating deliberate pausing, a consistent trail from inside the home over the threshold, down the walkway, to the street. This was slow, this was controlled, this was deliberate. The person who carried Nancy through her home that night was not panicking. He was not making chaotic, impulsive decisions. He entered through an unlocked back door, a door he knew would be unlocked because he knew her habits. He moved through the house with enough precision to control the situation without leaving visible evidence of force in the bedroom or the hallway. He carried her to the front entrance. He stopped at the threshold, paused long enough for satellite spatter to form, managing the logistics of the door before stepping through. He walked down the front walkway with the same controlled pace. He placed her in a vehicle parked exactly where a vehicle needed to be. Forensic analyst Rick Castigar, who spent 46 years with the Pima County Sheriff's Office, analyzed the doorbell footage and noted that the masked figure approached with his right shoulder turned toward the camera, his head angled to the left. That positioning, in Castigar's professional assessment, indicates awareness of where the camera was, not discovering it in the moment, knowing it was there before arriving. Someone who knows where cameras are located does not figure that out during the crime. They figure it out during reconnaissance, during visits to the area, during preparation. If the date that Google initially confirmed, showing a prior approach to the property in mid-January, is accurate, that reconnaissance happened 3 weeks before the night Nancy disappeared. 3 weeks to observe the home, 3 weeks to establish her routines, to confirm the back door was routinely unlocked, to plan the entry, the movement through the house, the exit. The blood evidence inside Nancy's home confirms what the other evidence had already been pointing toward. This was planned, this was prepared, and the person who planned it understood exactly what was required of them. One of the details that Dr. Valentine emphasized, something that speaks to the broader investigative integrity of this case, is the relationship between the assumptions investigators bring to a scene and the evidence they find. He described his approach to forensic scene processing. When you walk into a home, that home tells a story. The story is about how the person who lives there maintains their space. What is normal for them? What has been disrupted? But you can only recognize what is abnormal if you first understand what is normal. And you can only understand that by processing the scene methodically, moving through every room, documenting everything, letting the evidence guide you rather than imposing your assumptions onto the scene. He described it as reading a book. If you skip ahead, if you jump to the chapter you think is most relevant based on your initial assumptions, you miss the details in earlier chapters that give later events their meaning. The same logic applies to crime scene investigation. You process methodically. You let the evidence tell you what happened. You do not start with a conclusion and look for evidence to support it. In cases where forensic evidence is the primary driver of the investigation, where traditional investigative entry points are absent or limited, this discipline is not optional. It is the only pathway to resolution. Now we need to say something that no amount of forensic analysis should be allowed to obscure. Nancy Guthrie is not blood evidence. She is not a forensic case study. She is not a mystery to be solved or a puzzle to be assembled from physical patterns and expert testimony. She is a mother, a grandmother, a woman who spent decades building a life in the community she loved. She had friendships and daily routines. She had a home where she felt safe. She had a family who loved her, and children who described her with the kind of warmth that tells you everything about who she was to the people closest to her. Days before she disappeared, she was sleeping in her own bed. Within hours, someone entered that home, moved through the rooms she had lived in for years, and carried her out into the darkness while she bled. Savannah Guthrie continues her work every morning, visible to millions of people, carrying a weight that anyone watching can see. Nancy's grandchildren are growing up. Time keeps moving, and Nancy has not come home. The blood evidence inside Nancy's home has answered one question with forensic clarity. We now know where the blood evidence was located within the home. We know the path from inside the front entrance, over the threshold, down the walkway to the street. We know the pattern was consistent and controlled. We know the forensic characteristics of what was found suggest deliberate, methodical movement rather than violence and chaos. We know the evidence points toward a vehicle that exists and that likely contains forensic evidence connecting it to Nancy. But the questions that matter most remain unanswered. Where is Nancy now? Who did this? Why? And what happened to her after she was placed in that vehicle? The blood evidence is part of Nancy's story, a story that deserves to be told completely, a story that deserves resolution. For Nancy, for Savannah, for a family that has waited too long for answers they should not have to wait for. The forensic picture is clearer now than it was before. The evidence that has been preserved is pointing in specific directions. The vehicle exists. The clothing with blood on the back exists. The person who walked through Nancy's home that night and carried her out exists, and the evidence they left behind, including evidence they may not have known they were leaving, is still out there. Evidence does not disappear because time passes. It waits. It holds the story, and in cases built on physical evidence, that story eventually gets told. This investigation has been built on official law enforcement statements, verified reporting from credible news organizations, and the expert forensic analysis of Dr. Peter Valentine as reported by Ashley Banfield of News Nation. The forensic interpretations presented here represent expert analysis of documented physical evidence, not conclusions about any specific individual's guilt. That determination belongs to investigators, prosecutors, and ultimately a court of law. What the evidence tells us is this: what happened to Nancy Guthrie was planned. It was deliberate. It was carried out by someone with knowledge of her home, her routines, and her vulnerabilities. And the physical evidence of that night, including evidence the person responsible may not have known they were leaving, is the key to answering the questions that still need to be answered. Nancy deserves those answers. Her family deserves those answers. The evidence demands them. If you have any information related to the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, please contact the FBI at 1-800-CALL-FBI or tips.fbi.gov. The reward stands at over $1 million for information leading to her safe return or the identification and arrest of those responsible. If this investigation moved you, if this kind of deep evidence-based forensic analysis is what you come here for, subscribe to the Verdict Room right now and hit that notification bell. Every week, we go further than the headlines. We examine the evidence, we follow the facts, and we deliver the verdict. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. The blood evidence, the forensic analysis, the questions it raises, and the questions it still cannot answer. This is a community built on serious, evidence-based discussion. And in a case this complex, that conversation matters. What do you think the blood pattern tells us about what happened during those critical minutes inside Nancy's home? This is the Verdict Room. The evidence has spoken.